What if you knew you were going to die but had 32 minutes left to feel every second of it? That's not fiction. That's what happened to over 500 people aboard Japan Airlines Flight 123, and not a single thing they could do would change the ending. Welcome back to True Scary Air Disaster Stories, where each episode we uncover the real events behind the most terrifying aviation tragedies in modern history. Today, we are telling the story of a flight that didn't crash instantly, but stayed in the air long enough for everyone on board to understand exactly what was about to happen. This is Japan Airlines Flight 123, a routine domestic flight that turned into a slow-motion nightmare with the highest death toll of any single plane crash in history. So before we begin, let me ask, how are you doing today, really? I hope you're safe and well, because the story you're about to hear will stay with you long after it ends. August 12, 1985 was supposed to be a regular Monday in Japan. At Haneda Airport in Tokyo, passengers boarded Japan Airlines Flight 123 with little concern. It was a short domestic flight, just over 50 minutes, bound for Osaka. The aircraft assigned that day was a Boeing 747SR, a short-range variant of the iconic jumbo jet designed to carry a high number of passengers on internal Japanese routes. That plane had been in service for over 11 years and had carried millions of people safely through the skies. Its registration number was JA1.09. Among the 524 people on board were families returning home business travelers, and even a famous singer who chose the flight on a whim. The atmosphere in the cabin was calm, relaxed, even sleepy. Flight attendants moved through the aisles, checking seat belts and answering questions. In the cockpit sat Captain Masami Takahama, a veteran pilot with more than 12,000 flight hours. To his right was First Officer Yutaka Sasaki, and behind them, Flight Engineer Hiroshi Fukuda. Together, they formed a crew with thousands of hours of combined experience. There were no weather concerns, no security threats, no reason to suspect that within the next hour this flight would become the deadliest single aircraft crash in aviation history. But the seeds of disaster had been planted 7 years earlier. In 1978, the very same aircraft had experienced a tail strike during a landing at Osaka. It was repaired by Boeing mechanics, but not according to approved procedure. The rear pressure bulkhead, a critical structure that maintains cabin pressurization, had been fastened using a flawed method that weakened its integrity. For 7 years, the plane flew without issue. Thousands of flights, thousands of takeoffs and landings. But the damage was still there, slowly worsening, and on this warm summer day, it was about to fail. At 6:12 p.m., Flight 123 taxied from the gate and proceeded to the runway. Clearance was granted, and the aircraft began its takeoff roll. Inside the cockpit, checklists were called, instruments scanned, and power was applied. The aircraft lifted off smoothly, climbing into the sky with more than 500 lives aboard. The crew received instructions to continue climbing to 24,000 feet. For the first 12 minutes, everything was routine. Then at 6:24 p.m., as the aircraft leveled off, the rear pressure bulkhead finally gave way. The decompression was massive and violent. A section of the tail tore off, along with critical hydraulic lines. The crew felt a jolt and sudden vibration. Alarms rang out across the cockpit. Warning lights illuminated like a storm of chaos. Almost immediately, the pilots realized that something was very wrong. But what they did not yet know was that all 4 hydraulic systems, the very systems that allow a pilot to control the aircraft, had been destroyed. The plane was now flying without rudder, without elevator, without aileron control. The Boeing 747 had essentially become a massive, uncontrollable shell, kept airborne only by its speed and the subtle forces of trim engine thrust and aerodynamics. The yoke felt unresponsive. The aircraft began to yaw and pitch unpredictably. In the cabin, the oxygen mask dropped, but the damage was so severe that many passengers never received sufficient oxygen. Panic spread quickly. Some passengers screamed, others prayed. Some began writing farewell messages, and the flight crew, fighting against confusion, noise, and system failures, began broadcasting a mayday call. They reported an emergency and inability to control the aircraft. The Tokyo Area Control Center responded quickly, offering vectors back toward Haneda. But Flight 123 was no longer a flight in the traditional sense. It was an aircraft being carried by fate and physics, not command. The crew tried everything. They adjusted engine thrust, attempting to steer by increasing or decreasing power to one side. They cycled switches, checked breakers, reviewed the status of redundant systems. But the aircraft would not respond the way it should. It was now flying a shallow, uncontrolled turn. They were trapped in the sky, able to fly, but not to steer. That is perhaps the most terrifying truth of Flight 123. It did not fall from the sky instantly. It floated wounded and helpless for 32 long minutes. 32 minutes in which the crew fought to regain control. 32 minutes in which passengers knew they might die. And 32 minutes in which the smallest decisions, engine thrust, weight balance, flap positions, meant the difference between a controlled descent and a final spiral into the mountains. One mistake made years ago had waited for the right altitude and the right pressure to take effect. A single flawed repair buried inside metal and rivets had stayed quiet until it was too late. That is the cruelty of aviation negligence. It is not loud, it waits. The aircraft began a wide, uncontrolled turn to the left, drifting off its assigned course, as air traffic controllers in Tokyo watched the radar signature start to curve in ways it never should have. Flight 123 was no longer responding to standard commands, and though the voice of Captain Takahama remained steady, the situation inside the cockpit was rapidly deteriorating. The crew attempted to control the aircraft by manipulating thrust on each side of the plane, trying to turn the jumbo jet with power imbalance alone. It was a crude and desperate method, but it was all they had. In most aircraft, hydraulic systems are redundant, designed to withstand failure in one or even two circuits, but Flight 123 had lost all four. There was no precedent in commercial aviation for recovering a 747 under such conditions. None of the control surfaces were working, and the only hope lay in physics and willpower. The plane began to climb and descend in an unpredictable wave motion, what investigators would later describe as a phugoid oscillation, an up and down motion like a roller coaster but without guidance. As the minutes passed, the oscillation grew wider, rising thousands of feet before dipping back down again. At one point, the aircraft reached over 24,000 feet, then dipped below 16,000 in the next cycle. The crew fought to stabilize it using throttle input alone. Every movement was manual, nothing was automated, and every second in the air came with more uncertainty. Meanwhile, in the cabin, passengers began to understand that this was no ordinary turbulence. Some were crying, others whispering prayers. Children clung to their mothers, people held hands. Some began scribbling messages on the backs of air sickness bags or in small notebooks. One man wrote to his wife, telling her to be strong and to take care of their children. Another begged for forgiveness for words left unsaid. Each letter was written under shaking lights and deafening noise, many of them found later in the wreckage with handwriting that grew more frantic as the plane lost altitude. Flight attendants moved quickly, trying to calm people while also bracing for what felt inevitable. They secured loss items, provided updates when they could, and in moments of terrifying clarity told passengers to prepare for impact. It is hard to imagine the psychological weight of being airborne, knowing something is horribly wrong, but being unable to see the cockpit, unable to hear what the pilots are saying, and unable to change your fate. For the crew in the flight deck, the atmosphere was no less tense. Captain Takahama remained composed, issuing updates and acknowledging each change in motion. He requested a return to Haneda, but air traffic control struggled to track their flight path as the plane veered northwest toward mountainous terrain. At one point, another aircraft in the area, an American military jet from nearby Yokota Air Base, received a distress call but could do nothing to assist. Controllers offered vector after vector to try to guide the plane, but Flight 123 was beyond steering. All they could do was report their altitude and try to follow general headings based on visual references. But the cloud cover and failing daylight made even that difficult. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the mountains below, and inside the plane, the light grew dimmer as well. Oxygen deprivation added to the confusion. Many passengers were lightheaded, some unconscious, and even among the conscious few, there was a growing resignation. The cabin had turned from anxiety to helplessness, and from helplessness to farewell. And above it all, the plane continued its erratic path, a wounded giant swaying through the sky with no destination. The flight crew made one final effort to reach a safe descent path, manually adjusting engine thrust in an attempt to guide the nose toward flatter terrain. But every adjustment led to another overcorrection. As the aircraft descended for the last time, its path brought it dangerously close to Mount Takamagahara, a forested region of steep ridges and uninhabited wilderness. On the radar screen, the dot grew closer to elevation lines that spelled out catastrophe. The descent was accelerating. There was no flare, no landing gear deployed, no way to level out. The last transmission from the cockpit was garbled, a jumble of technical readouts and strained voices followed by silence. In that silence, the world held its breath. And in that silence, Japan Airlines Flight 123 disappeared from the sky. The impact came at 6:56 p.m. as the aircraft slammed into the mountainside of Mount Takamagahara in Ueno, Gunma Prefecture. The force of the crash shattered the plane into countless pieces, scattering wreckage across a forested slope so remote that even helicopters struggled to reach it. Immediately, the region was engulfed in silence, the kind that follows something unspeakable. Radar screens went blank. Rescue teams scrambled, but the terrain and the night slowed every effort. It took hours before emergency responders could reach the site, and when they did, what they found was beyond description. Burned wreckage, twisted metal, and the remains of what had once been hundreds of lives strewn across the hillside. Yet amid the devastation, there was a miracle. 4 survivors, a mother and her young daughter, a woman in her 20s, and a flight attendant were found alive, though injured severely. They had been seated near the tail section of the aircraft, which remained relatively intact. The rest of the passengers, 520 souls, were gone, making it the deadliest single aircraft accident in aviation history. What haunted the rescue teams even more than the scale of the destruction was what they found among the debris. Dozens of letters, farewell messages, handwritten moments before death. Some were addressed to children, others to spouses. Some simply said, "I love you one last time." The words were rushed, shaky, written in fear, but also in love. In those final minutes, hundreds of people faced the unthinkable and chose not to scream or panic, but to write, to connect, to leave something behind. Perhaps that is the part of this tragedy that leaves the deepest scar. Not the noise of the crash, but the silence of the acceptance. No one expected the cause of the crash to be what it was. A tail strike that happened 7 years earlier had been repaired improperly. The rear pressure bulkhead had not been fixed according to Boeing standards, and the incorrect repair caused a weakened joint to slowly fracture with every pressurized flight until it failed catastrophically. That small oversight, a single row of missing rivets, set in motion the destruction of 520 lives. Over a decade later, Boeing admitted responsibility, and Japanese investigators concluded that the crash was entirely preventable had proper procedures been followed. That fact made the loss even harder to accept. It was not a matter of bad weather or pilot error or a sudden explosion. It was paperwork. It was negligence hidden inside metal. It was the failure to double-check a job that was supposed to ensure safety forever. The final report stated that once the bulkhead failed, it ruptured the hydraulic lines, rendering the aircraft uncontrollable. And from that point, the flight crew did all they could. Their actions in keeping the aircraft in the air for 32 minutes were considered heroic, yet ultimately futile. And still, that half hour mattered. It mattered because in those 32 minutes, people said goodbye. People held each other. People made peace with what they could not change. In many ways, the tragedy of Flight 123 is not only the crash, but also the clarity that came before it. Everyone on board knew what was coming, and they met it not with chaos, but with a quiet courage. One passenger wrote in his letter, "Please live a long life and take care of our children." That sentence became etched into the national memory of Japan. It was broadcast on every channel. It was printed in newspapers. It was read at memorials and schools because it captured not just loss, but love. Flight 123 became a symbol not only of tragedy, but of the human ability to remain human even in the face of certain death. In the years since, safety standards have changed dramatically. Aircraft maintenance oversight became stricter, hydraulic redundancy was redesigned, and rear bulkhead repairs were re-engineered. But the real lesson of Flight 123 goes beyond technical fixes. It lives in the idea that every detail matters, that behind every bolt and bracket there are lives trusting that someone checked every inch, that trust is sacred, and once broken, it cannot be repaired. The passengers of Flight 123 never knew the name of the man who signed off on that repair in 1978. But their lives depended on him. And so do ours in every flight we take every day. If there is a truth that survives this story, it is this. Disasters do not always announce themselves in flames. They sometimes hide in silence and small, unchecked assumptions in moments long forgotten until it is too late. The news spread across Japan before the wreckage was even cold. Families gathered in airports, living rooms, and waiting halls, watching the television as breaking news updates confirmed what no one wanted to believe. Japan Airlines Flight 123 had crashed in the mountains, and nearly everyone on board was presumed dead. For the families of the 520 victims, time stopped. Many had been waiting at Osaka's Itami Airport, looking at the arrivals board, expecting to see their loved ones walk through the gate. Instead, what they received was a public announcement, a pause, and then a growing wave of disbelief that turned quickly into anguish. Some screamed, some collapsed, others simply stared ahead, refusing to accept what they were hearing. At hospitals across the country, lists of passengers were posted, but none of them carried the word safe. Only 4 names appeared under survivors. The rest were simply gone. There were husbands who never came home, wives who had promised to call, children who were on their way back from school trips. Entire families were erased in a matter of seconds, and the weight of that loss would hang over Japan for decades. At the crash site, rescue workers faced unbearable conditions. The mountainous terrain made it impossible for large teams to arrive quickly. Many of the first responders had to hike through dense forest, carrying stretchers and emergency kits on their backs. By the time they reached the site, night had fallen, and with it came rain insects, and the sounds of the wilderness pressing in on all sides. What they found was not a crash scene. It it was a graveyard. Many bodies were burned beyond recognition. Others were still strapped in their seats, their final expressions frozen in time. Some were holding hands, others were curled inward, but most haunting of all were the letters, hundreds of them. Scattered across the slope, tucked inside bags sealed in pockets or held tightly in hands. Messages written in the final minutes of life, some addressed to family, others to no one in particular. One child wrote to his mother apologizing for not doing better in school. Another note simply said, "I'm scared, but I love you." These words, written under impossible circumstances, would be delivered to the families in the days that followed. And those pieces of paper became everything, because they were the last thing left. For many parents, these notes were all they had. No body, no remains, just a few scribbled lines to cling to in the dark. One mother kept her daughter's farewell message in a glass case beside her bed. She never opened it again, but she couldn't bear to throw it away. Another man kept a wallet burned black from the fire because inside was a picture of his wife that had somehow survived. In the aftermath, Japan entered a period of collective mourning. Flags flew at half-mast. Schools held moments of silence. Television anchors delivered news with tears in their eyes. It was not just the scale of the disaster, it was the intimacy of it. The passengers of Flight 123 were not soldiers or strangers. They were neighbors, co-workers, friends. The pain was personal, and it was everywhere. Public outrage soon turned toward Boeing and toward the airline's maintenance procedures. Investigators revealed that the faulty repair on the rear pressure bulkhead had not been caught during years of inspections. The repair made by Boeing in 1978 had used a single row of rivets where two were required. The structure held for over 7 years, weakening slightly with each flight, and no one noticed, no one rechecked, no one challenged the assumption that everything was fine. That kind of mistake is the most dangerous one that hides beneath the surface, waiting for the right combination of time pressure and altitude. Boeing issued a statement of regret. Japan Airlines revised its inspection protocols. But for the families who had lost so much, these responses came too late. Compensation could not replace a father. A public apology could not fill a child's empty room. And the realization that their loved ones had suffered for 32 long minutes before the end that they had known that they had felt it coming was a wound that never truly healed. In the years that followed, many of the bereaved forum support groups visited the crash site annually and built memorials with the names of every passenger and crew member carved in stone. Pilgrimages were made to the mountain, where flowers were laid on the moss-covered ground. Survivors, including the lone flight attendant who lived, spoke in interviews about the sounds, the faces, the pain. But more than anything, they spoke of the silence afterward, the absence that echoed louder than the crash itself. One woman who lost her son said, "It is not the death that hurts. It is the memory of what could have been. He was 15. He had dreams. He was supposed to live." And perhaps that is what defines the legacy of Flight 123 more than the numbers or the fire or the data. It is the lives unlived, the birthdays missed, the empty chairs at dinner tables, the stories that never got to happen. The crash of Flight 123 did not just kill 520 people. It shattered thousands of futures. Some disasters fade with time, but others become a part of a nation's memory. Japan Airlines. Flight 123 was not just a crash. It was a moment that split history into before and after. In the years that followed, Japan did not forget the names carved into memorial stones, the letters sealed in silence the families left behind. There's a mountain where the wind still moves through twisted metal and scattered seats, and where every August voices return with flowers and prayer. It is not a place of noise, it is a place of remembering, Not everyone who died on that flight did so instantly. Many waited. They listened to the sound of the engines, to the words of strangers, to the pounding of their own hearts. They held hands. They wrote final messages. They sat in silence. 32 minutes is a long time to know you're going to die, but in that time, many passengers chose connection over fear. And that may be the most human thing of all. This crash was not caused by a storm, not by a terrorist or a failure of technology. It was caused by something quieter, a maintenance error buried deep inside the tail of the aircraft, a job done wrong and never checked again. The person who made that mistake may never have known the weight of what they left behind, but every bolt carries a name and every repair holds a life. This story is about what happens when we trust systems more than we question them, when we assume safety instead of ensuring it. And while aviation has changed dramatically since 1985, one truth remains: no checklist is more powerful than responsibility. No procedure can replace integrity. And sometimes the only thing standing between life and death is the honesty of the person holding the wrench. The families of the victims still return to Mount Takamagahara every year. They climb the trail to the crash site, many carrying photos or handwritten notes. They speak to the trees. They speak to the sky. And maybe they speak to the ones who never came home. One mother said, "I come here because I promised him I would come back to see him every year. And I keep my promise because he kept his. He was supposed to come home and he tried. They all tried." In the end, Flight 123 was not just a tragedy. It was a testament to human courage to love, spoken in the last possible moments, and to the painful lesson that nothing is too small to matter in a world held together by trust.